yield to him next, and then Senator Lummis, you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Hendren, in your testimony, you discussed the importance of taking into account drivers in different geographies when considering options to address the Highway Trust Fund shortfall. In particular, you discuss rural communities where driving far distances is often needed for basic necessities like going to work or visiting grocery stores or accessing health care. As a result, Arizonans, state that I represent, living in rural communities often pay for gasoline more often, making them more impacted by a gas tax increase. As Congress considers solutions to fund the Highway Trust Fund, are there any proposals out there which are less costly for residents of rural areas than the gas tax?
So, Senator, I think you hit the key point directly on target, which is currently rural communities are paying more in fuel tax, given the distances they need to drive to get their daily life activities done, as well as the vehicles in which they're driving. So I think that's the place we need to start, is exactly your comments. And if we look forward at a transformational way to have a sustainable funding source, the analysis that we have done so far using state data shows that a shift to a distance-based fee will result in slightly less payments for rural communities. So that's a start. So I think how we look and design the rates of that future user-based system need to take into account the different ways people use our roads. And so I think that's an opportunity that we have with this new way going forward.
And what kind of research has been done on user-based fees to date?
Sure. So what we recently did in several states on the eastern seaboard is we basically took states and we divided them into different communities and how people move. So you have rural communities, you have mixed communities that look rural but are going into cities, and then you look at what type of vehicles they have, look at how many miles they drive. And then we looked at the today in fuel tax versus tomorrow in a distance-based fee. So doing that data-specific, data-driven analysis has enabled me to go to rural legislatures in North Carolina who are very, concerned about this idea for their constituents and say, this is what the data is showing us. I'm a data person, so that's where I like to start, because it starts the conversation. And when you put the numbers in front of people, it makes them say, okay, maybe the way I thought today isn't exactly as I thought, so let's talk about tomorrow together. So that's the work we started to do.
Well, I appreciate you looking and going to the data. That's near and dear to my heart.
What is it?
Thank you. Mr. Kyle, I've got a couple more minutes here. I want to ask you about how the coronavirus pandemic has affected fuel consumption and gas tax revenues. The Arizona Department of Transportation recently reported that year over year, state fuel tax revenues were down 13% in 2020 compared to 2019, which in turn has affected funding for many surface transportation projects in Arizona. Some of this decline was likely due to the initial stay-at-home orders last spring, but long-term telework and virtual schooling have kept drivers off the roads. And I'm concerned that if these trends continue, the stress placed on the Highway Trust Fund could be more significant than expected. So, Mr. Kyle, in your testimony, you indicated that it would require about $195 billion, I believe, in general fund revenue to cover the Highway Trust Fund shortfall over the next 10 years. Do those calculations take into account these long-term trends that seem to be out there, which were accelerated by the pandemic, more telework, fewer in-person activities, which in turn results in fewer Americans on the roadways?
I think the long-run effects of the pandemic and perhaps changes in lifestyle that might occur are still being sorted out. There was obviously a reduction in driving over the course of the last year relative to recent history. I know for the trust fund itself, they're still working out exactly the implications of the last year for revenues to that fund, and we'd have to get back to you with specifics. We'd be happy to do that. But I believe that that's actually not entirely sorted out by IRS. In terms of longer run trends, it really does depend on what happens to mileage in the future and the number of vehicle miles in the future, and then also the fuel efficiency or the fuel economy of the vehicles driving those miles.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kyle.